Right now, I've shifted some of my hours to working actually at the food bank because of COVID-19. But I'm also working up at our rain garden at Lock and Dam #1. Everything that you see on the Instagram, if you follow us on Instagram, is from me. And I'm also taking online courses for my North Carolina Environmental Educator certification. So yeah, hi.
She plants flowers real fast, just to let you guys know. We were doing that together yesterday, and I was amazed at what she was doing in the rain garden. She's got a green thumb for sure.
Well, thank you. Is there anybody else that's Cape Riverwatch staff on? I can't see everybody because we have so many participants on here other than Kemp. Patrick, I don't think is on as of yet. So thank you again for joining. I'm Dana Sargent. I'm the executive director. Kaylin and Audrey and Patrick and Kemp and I have been just really trying our best to keep engaged with everybody and keep you all aware of what we're doing, and we would love your feedback. We have created a new YouTube channel. We're putting up a lot of videos over there. We're doing a lot more on Facebook. We're doing all this Zoom stuff. Kaylin, if you haven't seen it yet, Kaylin created an amazing eco tour of Greenfield Lake. It's on our Facebook page. It's on our website. It's also on our YouTube channel. Patrick is out and about doing water quality sampling and all that other stuff. We just put up some video that he captured from the drone. We got a drone donated to us last year from an amazing volunteer, and Patrick got certified and figured all that out, and he did some cool drone footage from the Lock and Dam this week. We just got a lot going on, and so we appreciate your continued support. To that end, if you feel like if you're able and willing to support in financially, please do so. Please visit our website. Please visit our website and just click donate, and it'll walk you through it. We would love your support. Obviously, you know, times are a little bit tough for everybody, so we completely understand, and we appreciate your support and just being here and just being engaged. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Kemp. I know most people here know who Kemp is. And I'm not going to go through his academic accolades. He's got too many, and I can't remember them all. But we know that Kemp Burdette is our Cape Fear Riverkeeper. Most of us do on this call, and he knows the river like the back of his hand, presuming he knows the back of his hand really, really well. And he has been the Riverkeeper, or been at Riverwatch for somewhere around 13 years. He has just an immense amount of knowledge about the advocacy issues and the water quality issues facing our basin. And so I am excited to hear what he's about to share, and I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody. So at the end, we'll open it back up to questions, and I will unmute y'all, and we can have a nice talk. So thank you again, and take it away, Kemp.
All right, good morning, everybody. It's good to see everybody's. Glad you're all here. All right, I'm gonna kick this thing off here, which will take me just a second to get my screen all shared, and we'll go for it. All right, hopefully you are now able to see my presentation. And Dana, can you see that okay?
Yep.
All right, great. Well, so I'm going to be talking a little bit today. I'm going to be talking a lot today about factory farms in the Cape Fear River Basin, which certainly a relevant topic for us as we have just an enormous number of these facilities, and each of them has an impact on water quality and therefore an impact on all of our lives. Just a reminder, this is our mission. This is what we do and why we do what we do. We're about protecting and improving water quality, so we're both trying to prevent present and future harms, and also go back and fix past harms. We work in the Cape Fear Basin and exclusively in the Cape Fear Basin, and we do that work through a combination of education, programming. Kaylin mentioned a lot of the education work we do, through advocacy work, which is primarily my role, and through action, which is primarily your role, where members come out and get involved and get on the water and do cleanups and that kind of thing. So I'm going to start out here, and I want you guys to remember this map. Quick question, Dana, can you see my cursor?
No.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So up here, you can see a map of North Carolina. The Cape Fear Basin is this basin that kind of cuts right through the heart of the state. Starts down here in Wilmington. This is a larger view of it, but it cuts right up through the middle of the state. And we're going to be focusing a lot on this kind of area right here today. This is Duplin County. This is Sampson County, right next to Duplin County. And right next to Sampson County is Bladen County. Wilmington is down here. So remember kind of where our watershed is as I go through maps later. So let's just kind of talk about what I'm going to be talking about, so you guys understand. I'm going to be talking about factory farms. I think factory farm is a term that aptly describes them. There is also an industry or a regulatory term that you may hear, and I may even slip up and say it. The full name is a concentrated animal feeding operation. That's frequently shortened to CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operation. So bringing lots of animals together to raise them. When you read regulations, you frequently read regulations about CAFO and CAFO permits and CAFO inspections. And so there's a few different ways of defining these things, but in general, I'll be talking about large CAFOs, which are factory farms with more than 2,500 hogs, more than 125,000 chickens, or more than 55,000 turkeys. So on a factory farm in the Cape Fear Basin, these animals are housed exclusively indoors. They never go outdoors. They never see the light of day. And their movement is severely restricted. So if you were to go inside one of these barns, I was inside one of these barns not that long ago, there's very little space to move around. There's even less space for animals to move around. And that's so that you can put as many animals as possible into one of these facilities. The whole goal is to raise as many animals as possible in as small of an area as possible. So everything about their lives is controlled, to the nth degree. Feed is carefully formulated and administered. Feed additives and subtherapeutic pharmaceutical use is common and frequently administered in the feed. And just as a quick reminder, we hear a lot about how many pharmaceuticals we use as Americans, and I think that's kind of sinking in. I think people really understand that we do in fact have a ton of pharmaceuticals in our lives that we use, but note that 80% of the pharmaceuticals that are used in this country, 80% of them are used for administering to animals on CAFOs. So think about the number of pharmaceuticals that humans use and realize that the vast majority of what we use in this country actually goes to animals. So when you think about kind of the impact of those pharmaceuticals on water quality through waste, and also on the impact of subtherapeutic antibiotic use, just everyday dosage of antibiotics in animals, and what that does to create, resistant bacteria. That's an important piece of this. On these facilities, waste is deposited in the barns, right? The animals never leave the barns, and so all the waste is collected in the barns. In the case of swine, the waste falls through slats in the floor and is then washed out into what are called lagoons, not lagoons like you think of in like movies like the Blue Lagoon. These are, cesspits of feces and urine that are recycled through the barns to wash out new feces and urine, and they sit out in the open. In the case of poultry, the dry litter is deposited by the animals, and every 1 or 2 cycles of the animals, they come in with big front end loaders and scoop out all this waste and then pile it into fields. So that's kind of how that works. The story of CAFOs is fairly new, really. This is a model that is real common in North Carolina, and sometimes it seems like it's been here forever, but really it only started in earnest in North Carolina in the 90s, in the early 90s. But this is kind of a chart that shows generally where animal agriculture is going and has gone in this country. We went from lots and lots of really small operations that were kind of spread out all over the place to very few with small numbers of animals on them. So lots and lots of small farms spread out over a wide area. And we've moved now into kind of the exact opposite, which is few farms with enormous amounts of animals on them. And in the case of the Cape Fear, and other places too, concentrated in really small areas. So North Carolina is the second leading producer of hogs in the country. Iowa produces more hogs than we do, but in North Carolina, we kind of condensed the area where we do produce them all into the coastal plain of the state. So fewer farms, many more animals. And that consolidation was not an accident. That's been driven by corporate integrators who see controlling the system all the way from the top to the bottom as the best way to make the most money. So these integrators are companies like Smithfield or Tyson, Sanderson Farms or Butterball, Prestige, any number of corporate meat producers. And so they own kind of the whole system. They own, the slaughterhouse at the top of the system. They own the feedlots. They frequently have trucking companies that fall underneath their business model. And so, they own all the valuable and all the critical parts of the system. And then what they do is they sign contracts with growers to raise the animals. So Smithfield, let's say, owns the pigs, they own the feed, they own the slaughterhouse where the pigs turn from animals into profit, but they leave the liability of that system with these operators. So they leave the waste lagoons, on the farms. They leave that liability with the farmers. In the case of poultry, they leave that poultry waste with the farms. And so, they make sure that they keep the profitable parts under corporate control, and they leave the liability with farmers. In this model, as you consolidate, as you make things bigger and bigger, you push smaller farms further and further to the outside, and eventually it becomes almost impossible for small farmers to compete in this industry, because the place where you make money as a farmer is at the slaughterhouse. And if Smithfield owns a slaughterhouse, they control who brings their animals to slaughter and who can make a profit on those. And so over time, you've seen integrators like Smithfield, just push everybody who's not willing to play the Smithfield game out of the business. So I want to just kind of give you an idea of the scale of the problem, and also just kind of the day-to-day you know, how the problem actually happens, because I think sometimes, you know, we're here, you know, down here in New Hanover County, we're not around this kind of epicenter of animal production in North Carolina. And so we don't see it very often. And I think it's easy to forget what's going on up here. But this is Duplin and Sampson County. Remember the map I showed you earlier? The Cape Fear Basin kind of goes up this way, loops around this way. Duplin County, the headwaters of the Northeast Cape Fear are in Duplin County. The headwaters of the Black River are in Sampson County, and the main stem of the Cape Fear goes through Bladen County here. And as you can see, each one of these pink dots is a swine CAFO. Each one of the yellow dots is a poultry CAFO. As you can see, this is the area in the state where combined we've got more CAFOs than any place else. In fact, these two basins alone have more concentrated animal feeding operations here in a small area than any other place on planet Earth. So we're not talking about just like, oh, this is a really dense area in North Carolina or on the East Coast or even in the US. This is the most densely concentrated area of concentrated animal feeding operations on planet Earth. So anytime you have a situation where you have more than any other place on the planet, no matter what it is, you can expect for there to be some negative impacts there. This is what it looks like if you're you get on Google Earth, or if you're flying in an airplane and you look down. This is Duplin County. Each one of those circles is a CAFO, either a swine or a poultry CAFO. And really, it's quite a bit worse than that. I could just kind of made this really crude map yesterday, and I went through and I just outlined all the streams. So these are small streams. This is Rockfish Creek over here. This is Six Runs Creek over here. Each one of these is a CAFO. And remember, you know, water is moving in this direction in this screen. So it's going from these small streams, these headwater streams, and it's collecting into larger streams and larger and larger. And so if you look at the layout of the land here, you can understand kind of what the problem is, right? Each one of these facilities is creating enormous amounts of waste. And these streams just wrap around each one of these facilities, all of these facilities. And these streams actually, of course, you know, continue up here. And so any waste that runs off of any of these facilities is going to collect in the headwaters and very quickly build up and accumulate into these kind of main streams and eventually down into the river. And you can see there's just almost no place in the landscape that isn't right next to one of these facilities. And there's no place in the landscape that also isn't very close to a stream. You know, we're a coastal plain area. We've got low topography, high water tables, and 55 inches of rain a year. So it's not hard to imagine how waste from these facilities in an area with as much concentration as you see here, for instance, winds up in our waterways. And this is a photograph from a plane. I'll talk a little bit about patrol flights that Patrick and I do, but you know, this is the way these things are situated. Very frequently, these are situated in the 100-year floodplain. Almost all of them are situated in the 500-year floodplain. And you can see just how close to these wetland areas they are, right? Here's a big swamp. This is a stream. Anytime you see kind of a line of trees, that's a stream. Here, another one. You know, you can see this one is running from all the way up here, running down past this swine lagoon, and it's literally sitting right on the banks of a large stream that flows into the Northeast Cape Fear River. And as you get up in a plane, you know, this is what you see all the time. You can kind of go back here. All these areas, these dark green areas, those are all streams and swamps and wetlands. And these farms are situated right next to them. So, of course, the problem is the waste, right? And I want to just kind of walk you through the way the waste gets into waterways. This is what Patrick and I do. On the left, this is Patrick Connell. He does a lot of our field work on CAFOs, and we're in a small plane here. just taken off from Oak Island, and we're on the way to fly up through Duplin, Sampson County, up through Bladen County. And we take a lot of photos, and we do a lot of looking for violations of the general permit for swine and the minimal regulations that are on the books for poultry. And so I'm just going to kind of show you kind of what we would look for and what we see. So here's a swine CAFO. You can see the lagoon here in the middle. You can see the barns, 4 barns here. This is a stream that runs through there. This is all kind of a wetland area. If you were to paddle this, which I've done, all these are kind of like lily pads. You know, this is all water underneath this aquatic vegetation. And you can see the spray field, as you might imagine, kind of angles down or tilts down towards the water. And so this spray field at its corner connects to this wetland. And if you look even closer, you can see here that there are lots of these darker circles on this field. And what that actually is sprinklers, sprayers. So they're spraying waste from this lagoon onto this field. And what happens is each of these barns has a pipe that comes out of the barn, and as you can see here, periodically they pull water from this lagoon, they flush it back through the barns, and they flush that waste out into this lagoon. So that lagoon is constantly being filled by the enormous number of animals that live in confinement in these barns. And then with these big industrial sized pumps, they pump this waste out onto these fields. It can be done a number of ways. It can be done here, like with set locations with these sprinklers. It can also be done with sprinklers that you move around, and these are not sprinklers. I think a little bit of a tame term. This is like a fire hose connected to an industrial size sprayer. So this is this would knock you down if you were standing in front of it. And then the other way that it can be applied to fields is on these big pivot head sprayers, which are anchored in the middle, and they just do circle after circle spraying this waste. So the waste comes out of the barns, into the lagoons, pumped from the lagoons to these giant sprayers, and then sprayed onto fields. And what frequently happens is that this waste is applied so heavily that the only thing it can do is run off fields, right? There are rules in the general permit for swine that says, you can't apply waste to ponded fields. You can't spray waste onto the ground once it starts to pool up, because once it starts to pool up, all it can do is run off. But we frequently see violations of that. Here's one. We submitted this one. And it was discovered on February 18th. It lasted for an undetermined amount of time. So for some period of time, they're not sure, waste was flowing off into a drainage ditch, into an unnamed tributary of the Cape Fear River. I think it's somewhat interesting to note that they decided that it was 15,000 gallons, even though they don't know how long it happened. But that is frequently what you see is minimal enforcement of environmental regulations, when there's enforcement at all. And this is what that would look like from the air, right? So here's another set of barns. Here's the lagoon. Here's the spray field. And notice kind of how wet the field is already. You can see all of this ponding throughout this field. And here is a pivot head sprayer. This is a sprayer that's anchored here in the middle and is doing a circle. It's in operation right now. It's actually spraying. And in addition to that sprayer, they pulled out at least three hose reel sprayers, and they're also spraying waste out of those. And they're spraying so much waste, and they've been spraying so much waste for so long, that they've actually created the headwaters of a new stream here, right? This stream is starting to make channels and flow down through this field and enter this stream. So this is just 100% raw animal waste that's being applied hour after hour, day after day, so much so that it's created permanent streams that are running across this field into this wetland. So you can imagine that this stream flows 24 hours a day, 7 days a week into a slightly larger stream, and then into a slightly larger, and eventually into the river. And so this is what it looks like. This is how it happens. And keep in mind, there are thousands of these facilities, all located in the coastal plain of North Carolina, that operate in almost identical ways. You know, there is a huge amount of waste that has to be applied to a limited number of fields. And this is not at all uncommon for over application to occur. Here's another example. This is a sprayer that's just spraying down into the ground into one place. It's creating this stream that's running across this field where cows are grazing. This is raw swine waste. Into this stream, you can see the algae build up here. This then runs into Black River. Same situation here. You can see with the angle of this shot, you know, the sun is kind of shining off of the standing water in this field. So here's a field that's soaked with water, so much so that it's pooled up. The water's running down here, running across this stream into this ditch, and eventually into the Black River. Now, poultry is a little bit different, but generally the same thing happens, right? Poultry litter is dry, and so it can't be, you know, pumped through sprayers and applied to field, but it can be scooped up and put into these big piles. This pile's under a barn. This is actually better than this, which is what you frequently see in Duplin and Sampson County, where just you have large piles of poultry litter in fields and staying in fields for weeks and weeks and weeks on end to just be, you know, washed away into ditches and streams by the rain. And then the goal presumably is to take this and to put it into one of these spreader trucks that then drives around and spreads this stuff out. On windy days, you can imagine, if you live nearby one of these facilities, what it's like to have just kind of raw poultry waste, you know, sprayed into the air into this fine dust that then kind of coats everything around there. These piles can be enormous. This is a very large pile. There are rules that say you have to cover your poultry litter if you plan to leave it out in the field for more than 15 days. This isn't covering this litter. This is putting a tarp over a portion of this giant pile of litter, and all the rest of this is still, of course, exposed. We've seen litter piles that have been out for months. We've seen litter piles that have been left out for years, year after year after year, just pure animal waste flowing into whichever the closest stream is. And that's what happens on a regular basis. So that's what goes on factory farms and the waste application sites on a daily basis, normal operations, you know, just everything happening under completely normal circumstances. When you have unusual circumstances like hurricanes, like Hurricane Floyd or Hurricane Matthew or Hurricane Florence, these systems frequently fail altogether. This is a lagoon that failed completely after Hurricane Florence. You can see the back corner of this lagoon has washed out entirely. All of the contents of that lagoon at one time, including the sludge at the bottom, spilled out of this corner into Wildcat Creek, which is a tributary of the Black River. This happened on the Northeast Cape Fear, it happened on the Black. Over here, you see lagoons that just are completely inundated. So these are CAFOs, and the water has just risen right up over these lagoons and training all of the waste in those lagoons into whatever stream flooded them. The animals inside these barns, of course, have drowned and are still there as well, whether they are swine or poultry. Here's a two large poultry barns. This is just upstream of the town of Chinquapin, and so you can see, you know, whatever's in these barns is kind of being pulled out by the river as it rises during a hurricane and washing down through this town, washing through homes and churches and schools. And there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more of these facilities upstream, and all of that waste and all of the bacteria and all of the heavy metals and all of the, you know, residuals from these additives to feeds, it's washing through communities. That's a problem. And then you've got, you know, just continually spraying onto flooded fields, you know, even as hurricanes approach, even as hurricanes are happening, and even as floodwaters are rising around these fields, you frequently see farmers continuing to spray. So, you know, kind of what's the big deal, right? It's just, if you talk to a hog farmer, they'll say, well, that's just, you know, we're just fertilizing our fields, right? There's no big deal here. It's just fertilizer. Well, it's not just fertilizer, and it's not just a normal application of fertilizer. If you kind of do the math, we have 10 million people, slightly more than 10 million people in North Carolina. We have roughly that same number of hogs in North Carolina. So you can start to kind of do some equivalency here on waste. So imagine that you've got 10 million people in the state of North Carolina. We know that we generally treat our sewage, and so we've got these 10 million people spread out over the entire state, and we're treating all that waste. And yet we still know that wastewater is an issue. Human wastewater is an issue. Now imagine 10 million hogs, but instead of being spread out all over the entire state of North Carolina, you slide all of those hogs east of I-95. So 10 million hogs east of I-95. And then, you know, understand that hogs produce quite a bit more waste than people, especially when they're being essentially force-fed to maximize growth and to make them grow as quickly as possible. So if you look at Sampson County, 1.9 million hogs in Sampson County, they produce the human equivalent in waste of 32.3 million people. So you've got 32.3 million people's worth of waste just in Sampson County and zero treatment, right? That's 14 times the size of the city of Charlotte. In Sampson County, no waste treatment. Duplin County, 1.7 million hogs. These numbers go up and down. Duplin and Sampson County are kind of neck and neck in the race to have the most hogs, and sometimes Duplin has more and sometimes Sampson has more, but in general, they all have close to 2 million. 30.1 million people's worth of waste in Duplin County, 25 times the population of Raleigh, no waste treatment. So the waste does matter when you start to talk about it in terms this big, right? That much waste is going to have an impact, and there's absolutely no treatment going on. Now, add on top of that the fact that we've got an expanding poultry industry in North Carolina. Poultry was kind of the industry that started this big vertical integration scheme, and then swine came to North Carolina and dominated the scene for 20 years, but now poultry is exploding in North Carolina. There's a moratorium on new swine CAFOs, and so swine CAFOs, although we already have more than any other place on the planet, we at least aren't having new ones being built. Poultry is not like that at all. There's almost no regulations around poultry. There's no permit required to build a poultry facility. There's no permit required to move birds onto that facility and raise those birds right now in North Carolina. All you have to do is build a poultry barn and sign a contract with an integrator, and you can start raising birds and trying to figure out how you're going to manage the waste from that. So we've got all of these poultry facilities in Duplin and Sampson County. 43% of all the hogs in North Carolina are raised in Duplin and Sampson County. And on top of that, we're layering poultry facilities. So we've got 762 new poultry facilities that are being built right next to, in many cases, swine facilities. And we already have 1,000 swine facilities in those two counties. And so you can just see the waste starting to pile up, literally starting to pile up. And animal waste, of course, has, you know, pretty harmful stuff in it, right? There's the obvious bacterial problem, E. coli, Enterococcus, Listeria bacteria, that if you come into contact with when that bacteria is still active in that waste, it can make you sick. You have the heavy metals that are added to animal feed to try to kind of stave off outbreaks, bacterial outbreaks. So they actually, you know, provide arsenic and arsenic compounds to the poultry. They provide copper to swine, and that's to try to minimize bacteria growth in animals in these really tight conditions. High levels of nutrients, of course, nitrogen and phosphorus. Poultry litter actually has even more nutrients in it than swine waste, and those nutrients are building up in the landscape across North Carolina, and has serious impacts on a wide variety of issues. For us, focusing on water quality, nutrients do the same thing in water as they do on land. So if you put fertilizer on your grass, you do that to make it grow fast, and if you put those nutrients in waterways, you make the algae in those waterways grow fast too. But it's an unnatural growth, and when that algae dies, it takes the oxygen that's in that water, dissolved in that water, and it pulls it to use in that decay process, and it takes it away from all of the species and all of the amphibians and fish that need that water in waterways, and so you have huge fish kills. And we've seen that time and time again after things like hurricanes. After Hurricane Florence, we had enormous fish kill in the Cape Fear, and dissolved oxygen levels were at 0 for a month in the Cape Fear River. And a significant portion of the cause there comes from these animal operations. There are also natural causes. Anytime you have huge floods like that, you're going to have natural, eutrophication of waterways. But in a situation like we have in the Cape Fear, where we've got more animal operations than any other place on the planet, you can bet that the animal waste that's being washed into those waterways is a major contributing factor. I talked a little bit at the beginning about antibiotic resistance. We're using so many antibiotics on these facilities that we're starting to build superbugs, and this is a well documented fact that animal operations are contributing to kind of these superbugs. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those health impacts in a couple of minutes. Climate change impacts from CAFOs, also well documented. Huge amount of greenhouse gases originate on CAFOs. And if you took just the top 5 meat and dairy producing corporations and you combined them, they would produce more greenhouse gas emissions than Exxon, Shell, and BP. And then, of course, you got floodplain issues. There are hundreds of swine CAFOs still located in the 100-year floodplain. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more located in the 500-year floodplain. And what we know after Hurricane Matthew and after Hurricane Florence is that terms like 100-year floodplain and 500-year floodplain in North Carolina don't really do a great job of describing risk, right? 100-year floodplain should probably be more like a 25-year floodplain in North Carolina. And 500-year floodplain should be more like the 100-year floodplains that were in reality. And then on top of those issues, there's a myriad of other impacts from CAFOs that Cape Fear Riverwatch doesn't engage in directly, but that we know are bad for communities, right? So anytime you have a single industry that has such negative impacts that moves into a rural area, nobody else is going to try to do business there, right? So you've got the poorest counties in the state are the ones with the highest concentrations of CAFOs. And until you start to diversify an economy, that's not going to change. Small farms can't compete in these areas. Slaughterhouse workers, it's well documented that some of the toughest and most dangerous work in America is in slaughterhouse process lines. And these farm workers as well are dealing with pretty tough work conditions. Animal welfare is a big issue, of course. And then just health, just dealing with both the health impacts from a food system that cares so little for public health, both in the product that's produced and also in the conditions that it's produced. And that kind of ties into something that's very important for Cape Fear Riverwatch, which is environmental injustice around these facilities. So if you drive out into Duplin County, and you drive around and you look until you find a spray field and you see that giant sprayer spraying waste out, a fine mist of waste that's drifting in the wind. The houses that waste drifts onto are not big fancy houses. They're small houses, frequently houses where people of color live, frequently houses where people with low wealth live. And you actually can find, if you take a swab and you go inside some of these houses, and I've been inside some of these houses, if you take a swab from the inside surfaces of these houses, inside the house, and you send that swab to a lab and you analyze it for fecal matter from swine, you find it. So imagine living somewhere where the farmer next to you is spraying so much hog waste into the air that is actually being found inside your house, on your kitchen counter, on your windows. Folks that live near these facilities are prisoners of their own homes. You know, they can't go outside. They can't go out in the yard and have a barbecue. They can't have a birthday party. They can't hang their clothes on the line. And they can't leave because their property has been so devalued by the fact that it's now located next to one of these facilities that they're trapped in a situation that is shortening their lives. There's a study that just came out of Duke University that confirmed this, right? That people that live next to these facilities, controlling for all other factors, people who live next to swine farms get sicker. They get sicker more often, they stay sicker longer, and their lives are shorter because they live next to these concentrated animal feeding operations. And those people that we're talking about are frequently people of color and low-income people that have very few other options than just to stay where they are. And that led to, over the last couple of years, kind of people finally saying, look, enough's enough. We're not going to take this anymore. We want this to stop. We want to be able to go outside and sit on our porch and visit with our family, and we want to do that without having hog waste sprayed on us. And so about 500 North Carolinians got together and filed nuisance lawsuits against Smithfield. And they started to win those lawsuits. And you know, they weren't winning those lawsuits based on you know, some judge who really hated swine CAFOs. These were jury lawsuits, and so both sides of these lawsuits picked jury members. They picked juries of our peers. The pork industry threw out the jury members it wanted to throw out. So these were military folks. These were policemen. These were teachers. These were farmers. These were housewives. These were people that were made up of a representative sample from our communities. And in every case, juries of our peers found Smithfield guilty. And that's important because what the industry would have you believe is that this has been somehow kind of an effort by a you know, crazy group of environmentalists or a group of trial lawyers that wanted to make big money. These were jury cases, and juries unanimously found Smithfield guilty in each of the 5 lawsuits that have been brought so far. They heard evidence. They heard evidence presented by the industry. They heard evidence presented by the neighbors. They saw scientific data that was collected. I mentioned those swabs from inside people's homes. They saw photographs. They saw records. They heard testimony, and they found the industry guilty. And you know, there was actually some hope that things might change there for a while. And then a little bit of reality set in, which is this industry is incredibly powerful. This is 2016 receipts. These went up in 2017 to a little over $11.5 billion. And animal agriculture is responsible for the vast majority of that. So like 75% of all agriculture income in North Carolina comes from livestock, dairy, and poultry. Incredibly influential in the North Carolina General Assembly, incredibly influential in these rural counties, and growing every day. So what does that mean? It means that the Pork Council or the Poultry Federation can send, you know, armies of lobbyists into the North Carolina General Assembly. They can give literally millions of dollars in campaign contributions to our elected officials, and they can write laws. They can actually write the laws and hand them to elected officials to be introduced on the House, on the floor of the North Carolina General Assembly and voted on by other people who have been given campaign contributions by the Pork Council or the Poultry Federation. And those laws start to change the way we can respond to this industry. So laws have been introduced and passed that limit what can be revealed about complaints. So when Patrick and I get up in a plane, we fly over a farm, we see a poultry pile that's been left out for more than 15 days, or more than 30 days, or more than 90 days, and we report that. We are then cut off from that process. So if I call back and say, hey, I just flew again, I just saw that same pile again that I reported 2 months ago to you, what's going on with that? Why isn't that being fixed? Their response is, we are prohibited from revealing information about that complaint to you. It's the same if a neighbor did it. If you had a swine facility next door to you that was spraying swine waste directly onto your yard and you filed a complaint, you would not be able to get more information on that complaint until a notice of violation was issued on that facility. And that notice of violation is arbitrary. It's left up to regulators to issue a notice of violation or to go out to that farm and say, hey, can you maybe try to get a tarp over that waste, or can you try to turn that sprayer another direction? There's minimal enforcement on some of these laws, and we know that because we file complaints on a regular basis. Patrick files referrals almost every time he flies for violations of these waste management. Laws have been passed that criminalize reporting crimes. So if you're a worker on a factory farm in North Carolina, it is a crime for you to report a crime on that facility. Think about that. There's a law that says you can be penalized for reporting a crime. That's crazy. They've limited the ability to conduct drone surveillance. So these facilities do not want people to see what goes on in those facilities, and so they've limited, drone flights around them. I talked about those nuisance lawsuits just now. The industry fought those nuisance lawsuits as hard as they could. They tried to say they weren't valid and they couldn't go to court. When they got to court, they tried to hire, big time attorneys that used every trick in the book to evade conviction. And when they were convicted, they did damage control, and they passed 2 laws in North Carolina, House Bill 467 and Senate Bill 711, that prohibited, that made it impossible for North Carolinians to ever file nuisance lawsuits again. So those 500 people filed those lawsuits. They tried to retroactively eliminate that option. They weren't able to do that, but now you and I don't have the same rights under nuisance suits as we did 2 years ago. So they've eliminated our ability to fight back against this industry. They've reduced the budgets of environmental regulatory agencies. So the General Assembly approves the state budget. They alter the state budget as they see fit. And what they've done time and time and time again over the last 15 years is they have consistently reduced DEQ's regulatory budget. So they've made it more and more difficult for the Department of Environmental Quality to regulate these industries and other industries. They've slashed staff, they've slashed budgets by over 40%. And they've basically kind of created this culture of fear in regulatory agencies where if they go out and do their job, they can expect to get even greater budget cuts in the next session of the General Assembly. They prohibited additional regulation on factory farms. Last session, Senator Peterson introduced a bill, a poultry study bill, just the bill to say, look, this industry is a pretty big deal. It's growing. It's enormous. It produces more waste than any other industry in North Carolina. It's bigger than the swine industry, and we know almost nothing about it. And by almost nothing, he's exactly right. DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, doesn't even know where poultry farms are located in the state of North Carolina because the Department of Ag will not share that information with them because the Department of Ag is completely captured by the industry. So Senator Peterson introduced a bill that said, I think we should just take a look at this. It's a study bill. We should just study this issue. We should just have experts actually determine whether or not there's anything to be concerned about. Even that study bill was prohibited from even being heard And so that's the power that this industry has. And the very few regulations that we do have in place, as I said, the industry ignores, right? So those waste management violations that we report all the time, you know, the industry is not scared of those at all. They frequently just ignore them altogether. There's been widespread fraud. You may have seen reporting last year about lagoon sampling. So lagoons are required to be sampled once a year, and it turns out this guy was going out and taking 25 samples from one good lagoon and then saying that he had been sampling around to all these other places. Record keeping is ridiculous on these facilities, and it's not available to you or me, and frequently not available to DEQ inspectors. It's kept on site. It can be on the back of an envelope. And it can be altered very easily because inspectors give ample notice before they come out to do inspections. And so, you know, if you report a violation, the inspector is going to say, hey, I need to come out and take a look at your books, at which point an operator can go through and cook his books to say whatever he thinks he needs to say to minimize penalties. Minimal follow through on complaints. We actually had to sue the state of North Carolina 3 years ago because we realized that when we were filing these complaints, they weren't even responding. They were just ignoring us altogether. And we won that lawsuit. And now they are required to do a little bit more to follow up on those complaints. But it's like every step of the way, you have to fight a system that is really, you know, pretty resistant to enforcing minimal environmental regulations. And then even when they do acknowledge that a problem has happened, the fines are minimal. Penalties are minimal, and that really isn't much of an incentive for CAFOs to do better. Slaughterhouses are part of this system, right? They're the part at the top. That's where everything goes when it's grown. And in North Carolina, slaughterhouses especially are a big deal. The largest swine slaughterhouse on planet Earth is in the Cape Fear Basin. 60 miles up the road in Tar Heel. It's a huge facility. It slaughters 35,000 hogs a day. Think about that. 200 or 225 pound animals, 35,000 of them slaughtered in a day. Think about the waste that's produced in a system like that. The largest poultry slaughterhouse in the country is 20 miles away from the largest swine slaughterhouse in the country, at Lumber Bridge in the Lumber Basin. So figuring out how to manage waste from slaughterhouses is really important because these slaughterhouses discharge into the river. And in the case of Smithfield, they discharge into the Cape Fear River above where our drinking water intake pulls drinking water out of the river. So Cape Fear River Watch recently filed a lawsuit against the EPA because the EPA was refusing to update effluent limitation guidelines on slaughterhouses. So there are guidelines that say, hey, let's take a look at technology. Let's see what we can do to remove pollutants from discharges, and let's implement that. And that's supposed to be reviewed like every 5 years because we know that we're getting better and better at removing contaminants. Well, the ELGs, the effluent limitations for guidelines for slaughterhouses, haven't been reviewed in 15 years, and the EPA is continuing to try to resist review of the ELGs, even though some slaughterhouses in the country have just gone through and have already made improvements. So the evidence that improvements can be made is there because they're actually in place in some places. And yet the EPA recently announced that they weren't going to require a review of ELGs, which is a huge way of reducing pollutants in waterways. And so we filed a lawsuit along with other folks. And just the day before yesterday, on the 30th, that lawsuit got to go ahead to move forward. And you know, not hearing a ton about this now because, you know, most of the news we hear these days is about coronavirus, which is certainly important. The plant at Smithfield is also trying to increase its line speed. So it's trying to speed up the rate that animals move through the facility. The only reason to speed up the rate that animals move through the facility is so that you can add more animals. So they're looking to increase the number of animals that they slaughter at what is already the largest slaughterhouse on the planet, and we're taking legal action to challenge that as well, saying that you know, this system can't handle any more waste. We're already receiving just huge inputs of waste from this facility into the Cape Fear River, on top of the inputs that we're receiving from all of the facilities that feed that slaughterhouse. And then coronavirus happens, right? So you've got all this stuff going on kind of on a normal day, and then coronavirus hits these slaughterhouses. And I assume you guys have probably been seeing some of the news around this. You know, these outbreaks hit slaughterhouse facilities in South Dakota and Iowa first, closing some of them, but they're here now. And they're growing very quickly in North Carolina. And I think that news about these facilities is going to be at the very front of this issue. We went from 7 outbreaks at 7 facilities on Wednesday to 13 on Thursday to 15 on Friday. We went from 200 confirmed cases. No, we went from 190 confirmed cases to over 600 confirmed cases in a couple of days. And really, as we know, we don't actually know a whole lot about what's going on at these facilities because they don't tell people. You can see the top of this headline. Nobody will say how many workers at Smithfield Tar Heel plant have the coronavirus. Smithfield in Tar Heel came this close to shutting down a couple of days ago. And then President Trump passed the executive order that found these facilities were essential, right? And so what that does is it basically gives cover for companies like Smithfield that are forcing workers to work like this, shoulder to shoulder, with minimal protective gear. We know that there's been several lawsuits already against integrators for not providing protective gear on the line. And what this executive order does is basically shield these companies by saying, look, this is a matter of national security. Therefore, you can force workers to work in unsafe conditions and not be liable for it. So when you think about the political power, I talked a lot about the political power at the state level, but these industries have an enormous amount of political power at the federal level as well. So how do you fix it, right? So I just went through like a really depressing talk with tons of problems, and you say to yourself, well, how do you fight an industry that can just have an executive order passed to shield itself? And that's a really good question, and it's not an easy question to answer. There is no single fix, and none of the fixes are easy. But that doesn't mean that we can't work to fix the problem. So, you know, I'll talk a lot about kind of North Carolina issues, but there are efforts at the federal level to work on these issues as well. But at the very basic level, if we look at the growth of poultry in North Carolina, it is not unreasonable to say we need to put the brakes on this industry in North Carolina until we at least understand what the impacts are. So banning new poultry facilities that can pop up without even having a permit seems like a pretty good place to start. Enacting aggressive climate change regulations around these industries. You know, we're here in New Hanover County or in southeastern North Carolina, where the impacts of climate change are going to be seen, you know, well before they're seen in other places, and those impacts are going to be larger than they are in other places. We're kind of sandwiched between the Atlantic Ocean and the Cape Fear River. We need to be doing everything we can in North Carolina to enact aggressive climate change laws, and this industry is a great place to start. Just enforce existing laws. So, you know, there are some laws on the books and they are frequently ignored. If we were aggressively enforcing existing laws, that would help. Eliminate the stormwater exemption. These facilities operate under this exemption that they were given when the Clean Water Act was created that said we're not going to penalize you for pollution that is just running off your facilities on a day-to-day basis. It's called the stormwater exemption. That, you know, they should have to manage their stormwater just the way other industry has to manage their stormwater. Hold integrators responsible for the waste they create. You know, this was kind of a genius move by Smithfield and Purdue and Tyson when they said, look, we're gonna handle all the stuff that is valuable, and we're gonna leave these operators responsible for all the waste. And then we're going to cut the profit margins down to minimum. And so the only way to really make money in these facilities sometimes is to find ways to shortcut on your waste management. Well, if Smithfield was responsible for the waste they create on these facilities, if they knew that they could be in court, you can bet that they'd figure out ways to treat that waste, and they'd invest in treating that waste. There are alternatives both to the way they treat waste on these facilities and these facilities in general, and some federal investment would go a long way there. Buyout programs would also go a long way. Getting the worst of these facilities out of floodplains would go a long way. There is a buyout program in North Carolina. It hadn't been funded in any relevant amount since Floyd, and yet we've had Matthew and Florence come through and just decimate farms and floodplains. Encourage smaller scale sustainable farms. So, you know, that's the alternative here, is that we switch the system back. And I'm not talking about like, let's switch the system back to the way it was in the 1930s. I'm talking about maybe let's just switch the system back to the way it was in the 1990s. That wasn't that long ago. That's still my playlist. 1990s is my sweet spot for music. It's not that long. I grew up with that. Like, this change that you've seen in the industry is recent. It's very recent, and it is exploding forward. So we need to think about kind of taking a few steps back, and then finally changing the way we eat and the way we contribute to the problem could go a long way. And this is always a big one. You know, if you value the environment, if you value water quality, then vote with those priorities in mind, right? Because if we keep electing people that serve Smithfield or Tyson or Prestige or Butterball, if we keep electing people that serve those industries instead of serving us, then we're going to continue to see these problems. And so, you know, it requires some effort and some research and some understanding of these issues, and it requires us to make a commitment to changing them. And then finally, support local sustainable farms. And we have local sustainable farms here. Maybe you don't know about them. I certainly didn't know about all of these guys until I started looking. But we do have them. They're great farms, and you can go visit and you can buy their products at farmers markets, and you can pay a little bit more to know that you're not part of this system, which just has a wide range of implications for people of color, for people that live around these facilities, for workers, for animal rights, for water quality, for climate. You know, you can say to yourself, look, it makes more sense for me to support a small farm where I can go out and I can meet a farmer and I can look at animals as they run around on the field, and they don't concentrate their waste in ways that impacts water quality, where they don't make the lives of people that live next to these facilities miserable, where they're not kind of part of this big corporate system that has so many problems. You can do that. So I pulled this list off of our website, but you know, there's addresses, there's phone numbers. Check them out. You can get a CSA, you can go to the farmer's market, and you can go out and visit the farm in person. So I got just a couple of closing thoughts, and then we're done. And this is not CAFO specific. These are just, I kind of throw these in, and really they apply to a lot of the issues that CAFO River Watch works on. But they're important things to remember. What happens upstream affects everything downstream. So just because you don't see the hog farms in Duplin County or the poultry farms in Sampson County or the slaughterhouses in Bladen County, just because you don't see them doesn't mean they're not impacting your life every single day, right? So remember that you've got to think about what's upstream, not just what's outside your door. This argument that economic development and environmental protection are in a constant battle is hogwash, pardon the pun. We both have to have a safe and healthy environment, and not only do we have to have a safe and healthy environment for us, but if we don't have a safe and healthy environment, economic development will never succeed in those areas. If we turn the state of North Carolina into a cesspool, we will lose any chance we have for economic prosperity. And this is, if you think about it, if you go to the counties in North Carolina where CAFOs are prevalent and you look at the poverty levels there and you look at the job levels there, they're some of the worst in the state. If you look at places where in the state where we're taking care of our environment and we're building, you know, green infrastructure and we're doing green development, you see that economic development frequently follows. So don't fall for that argument that we've got to cut regulations in order to be successful, because the only people that are winning when you cut regulations are a few corporations, and that money doesn't make its way into the local economy. Industries that don't account for their waste, if they're not paying for their waste in their process, then somebody's paying for it, and almost universally that's you and me. We pay for the waste at these companies, whether it's Chemours, whether it's Smithfield, whether it's Duke Energy. We pay for the waste that they don't manage when they put it into our public waterways, when they put it into our air, and that's wrong, right? That is irresponsible, and it's wrong, and it's unethical, and it's illegal for them to make money off of our health. We need to use the precautionary principle of risk management. We need to say, you know, when something is dangerous, we need to pay a whole lot of attention to that before we unleash it into the world, rather than just saying, hey, here's an idea, let's unleash it. I think we're going to make a lot of money off of it, and we'll deal with the negative repercussions later, which is kind of the way we do things right now. Laws without enforcement are meaningless, and that's a situation where, you know, we kind of have in North Carolina. Things are getting a little bit better in North Carolina, but there for a while, Department of Environmental Quality was doing absolutely nothing to enforce laws on these facilities and in other places. And so if you don't enforce the laws on the books, nobody's going to follow them. And if you don't empower these agencies to be regulators, if you keep them scared with budget cuts and threats, then the people of North Carolina are going to suffer. And I think the North Carolina General Assembly needs to remember that. Environmental injustice is real. It's not just a term. Drive into Duplin County and look around, and you see it almost everywhere you look, and it's wrong. I mean, this is the United States of America in 2020, and there are people of color, low-income people that are systemically exposed to greater environmental risk and systemically restricted from interacting with their environment in positive ways. In 2020, in the United States of America, it's wrong, and we can do better. Undue corporate influence in the General Assembly is bad for everybody except for corporations, right? When corporations start to write laws and have laws passed by people that they're giving money to, we all suffer, and that's more and more common. And then the last one, in the absence of strong support for environmental protection at the state and federal level, especially at the federal level right now, where we're seeing, you know, rule and law just completely ignored, we need to do a better job about having strong local protections. And that's it. That's my quote, to just remind everybody that not only are we in this coronavirus thing together, which is a phrase I keep hearing, but we're in this world together. We share this environment, we share this water, and we need to be working together, because if we don't, we're all going to suffer. And that's it. And I don't really know what I'm supposed to do now, Dana.
Hey, Kemp. So just unclick share your screen so we can see the people again.
Okay.
And I ended up going Facebook Live
Oh, good.
with my phone. So I've let the folks on there know that they can post questions. I'm going to try to keep my eye on that. And we've got questions in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and unmute people. Just give me 1 second, everybody. There we go. Okay, everybody is unmuted. So if you're not talking, please keep quiet. Otherwise, feel free to jump in with questions, and I'll go to the chat board and see what questions we've got there as well, and I'll keep track of that. If you want to there, I'll read them out to him.
Yeah, I can see a couple of those. Can you identify the sponsors of the bills? And we're talking about the bills that were passed to protect industry here. And yes, you can definitely see the sponsors of those bills. There's been a lot of bills. I think what I would do here, so that I don't get in a situation where I'm appearing to support or oppose political candidates, I will just encourage people to find those bills, which you can do on the North Carolina General Assembly page, and you can look them up, and it's going to take some work, and I acknowledge that, but you can find who the sponsors were and who voted in favor of these bills, and a little bit of Googling would probably get you a lot more information. So I'm not going to actually go through and name all the names. I don't even know all the names, I'm sure, but that's how I'll answer that. Is it true that federal money is given to CAFO owners when they lock the animals inside to drown during storms? Yes. So after Florence, CAFOs were given funds to help with the disposal of those animals and the cost that operators incurred from losing those animals. So yes, that is true. Let's see. Next question. Well, that's just more of an encouragement. And I think you're right. I think there are CAFO operators that want out. It's a tough system to be in, especially the poultry industry, swine industry as well. But the poultry industry, because of the fact that there is no moratorium on poultry, the contracts that poultry growers sign can be very abusive. And the integrators, you're absolutely right, Debbie, are kind of the root cause here of the problem. Integrators are in it for the integrators, right? They want to make as much money as they possibly can. They're not super concerned about farmers. They're not concerned about the people that live around these farms. They're not concerned about their slaughterhouse workers, as evidenced by how poorly they cared for them during this. So totally agree. And then David said, is there a specific reason farms are near waterways, or are there so many waterways that the family farmland was there for many years? Well, so it's kind of there's a lot to that. I mean, in some ways, all the land is near waterways in eastern North Carolina. And that map that I had up, you know, we're just such a flat, low-lying area. We're a coastal plain, and so it's difficult really to find land that's not fairly close to some waterway in eastern North Carolina. But that's why CAFOs are in the coastal plain and not in the mountains, right? Because you need to be able to spray waste and not have it just pouring down hillsides. And so that's why they're set up in the coastal plain, and that's why they're concentrated in the coastal plain. Poultry litter, being a dry litter, can be applied and it doesn't literally, you know, wash downhill. And so you see I talked a lot about poultry in the Cape Fear Basin, and it's a big problem in the Cape Fear Basin. It's the fastest growing, Duplin and Sampson County are the fastest growing areas in the state for poultry, but poultry is spread across North Carolina. And some of the most concentrated areas are like west of Charlotte, some of the other most concentrated areas. But so you can deal with poultry waste in areas that aren't in the coastal plain, but it's very difficult to deal with swine waste in areas that aren't in the coastal plain. And I just want to recognize, just as a, well, Larry Cahoon is one of our board members. I see him on the call here, and is probably knows more about swine waste in the coastal plain of North Carolina than just about anybody else, and so certainly knows more about the details of that than I do. So, Larry, feel free to jump in with some additional information as you see fit.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, cool. Well, yeah, there's more information than I have time to tell you. Depends on the question. I see one question here from Dave Bergdahl. Are there any places where reversal of these practices have been achieved? It's a very tough nut to crack. I was trying to remember the name of a farm in Virginia where traditional animal agriculture had been implemented by a guy who was very, very determined. And he had to overcome all kinds of regulatory hurdles to raise animals and market their meat in the old-fashioned way. We have meat inspection laws and laws about what you can sell and how you can do that. And you know, the animals might be as healthy as any animal you'd ever find, but the federal regulations were all designed around large-scale production. The entire industry that we're talking about here, it's hard to describe adequately, but its influence and the way that the system works dominates every arena that you might investigate. It's not just the waste disposal rules, it's how the animals are handled, how they're marketed, how we handle meat inspections, what slaughterhouses have to do and what they're not allowed to do, all kinds of things like that. So it's it's like an ecosystem of meat production that generates all this waste and all these other problems. And you can't just go in and fix one piece of it without having to tangle with all the rest of it. So it's very difficult. We can certainly chip away. I will tell you, as an aside, the industry's really, really big fear, and the thing that might do them in regardless, is actually epidemic disease. Union County in North Carolina used to have turkey production operations in that county, and they're all gone because they had a disease called white spike. It's a kind of virus. And there was no way to sterilize those turkey houses from one crop to another. And the consequence was that they just had to shut them all down. That is the nightmare. And the industry is well aware of that. That's something that you don't hear much talk about. But they're having more and more trouble with it throughout North Carolina, everywhere pretty much. You raise crop after crop after crop of animals in close confinement. How do you clean those confinement places from crop to crop? I don't know. I don't know.
You see, as you drive around, these facilities are posted with little signs that abbreviate whatever kind of outbreak they're having.
Right.
And so some of them are having multiple outbreaks at a time, and they put those signs up because they're trying to warn truck drivers that are driving feed in and out on a weekly basis, or
that's right.
animal delivery and animal removal, and then worker entry and
Right.
exit. So you have a ton of ways that this stuff is introduced. But
Right.
if you look just at poultry CAFOs in North Carolina, 93% of the poultry CAFOs in North Carolina, 93% of the poultry CAFOs in Duplin and Sampson County are within 3 miles, not of another poultry CAFO, but within 3 miles of 20 other CAFOs, swine or poultry. Every single one, or 93% of them, are within 3 miles of 20 others. And so there is no way to isolate one of these facilities from all the other facilities. And so an outbreak situation, it's not a matter of if, it's definitely a matter of when. And we already have outbreak situations here.
Yeah.
The industry just, in the example of porcine epidemic diarrhea, PED, that's the sign you see very frequently. It kills young pigs, and they just deal with the losses. They just remove them. They just put them in dead boxes. They just bury them.
Yeah.
And they just take the survivors and raise those. It's just the cost of doing business.
I have to tell you a horror story. It's in a perverse way kind of funny. After the hoof and mouth disease outbreak in Britain in 2001, that compelled the British to slaughter every cow within 100 miles of the center of the outbreak. And that was the only way they could handle it. They had to kill every cow, over 1 million of them. The folks here in North Carolina realized if that were to happen here, in say Duplin County, hoof and mouth can infect swine too, they were going to have to slaughter the entire herd within 60 or 100 miles of wherever the center of the outbreak was. And that would be millions of swine.
Right.
And,
it'd be 5 million just in Duplin and Sampson
yeah,
County.
right. Well, which is a lot of pigs. And what they found out after Hurricane Floyd, when they had 100,000 or so die, they really had very few options for how you handle all those dead. And so the phone call I got, and I thought it was a prank. I didn't believe this was serious. And this came from a couple guys with the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. They said, we have an exercise called Red Dawn, literally, capital letters. And we've got 2 million dead swine in Duplin County. And we figure that what we want to do is dump them in the ocean. Yeah.
Right. What could go wrong?
I thought they were pulling my leg. I thought they were setting me up for something. And no, they were serious. They had a conference in Raleigh to discuss this. About 60 people showed up, and a couple of us, I was one of them. I think we managed to talk them out of that scenario. Yeah.
Well, let's hope so, because we're facing what we are looking at in North Carolina potentially, and I certainly don't want to, we are not here yet, although other states in the country are here now, is that, and this is a coronavirus impact that I don't think a lot of people saw coming, but if your slaughterhouse facilities, if they've been so consolidated that we don't have the options of processing animals at other facilities, because we've got these mega slaughterhouses like the Smithfield plant. If the Smithfield plant outbreak continues to grow at the rate it's growing, and that facility has to shut down, they don't have another option. They don't have enough workers to process those animals. Those animals will not just sit in those barns. If the poultry slaughterhouse at Lumber Bridge, the largest one in the country, has to shut down because of their outbreak, those animals won't just sit there. Those animals will be culled, which means those animals will be killed.
Yeah.
And you'll have massive animal mortality in North Carolina, and we will be in a situation where we have to figure out how to manage that many dead animals in a way that doesn't impact people. And so, in Iowa, they're taking those animals to the landfill. They're killing them at slaughterhouses, and they're taking those animals to a landfill, which you may argue is better than just burying them on site, which is what they've done with animals in other outbreaks like PED. You see these mass graves, these mass burial sites on facilities. But, you know, if you look at those maps I showed you, those facilities are located right next to floodplains, right next to wetlands. And so you bury 1,000 or 2,000 or 4,000 hogs in a giant pit in the ground, you can bet that you're going to have impacts on water quality, groundwater, impacts on surface water, and you're going to have impacts on health around those facilities. And it's the same with poultry. So, you know, I hope it doesn't come to that in North Carolina. It's already come to that in Iowa, but I think it is certainly, and I don't want to say probably, but it is certainly a possibility in North Carolina that we're going to start culling CAFOs.
I'm just going to jump in real quick and let everybody know there was some background noise, so I muted everybody again. I apologize. I know that's like it's frustrating, but if you have a question, please unmute yourself first, or feel free to put it in the chat. There is a good question here from David. Are there any places where reversal of these practices have been achieved? If so, what was the first lever?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few answers to that. I mean, there's like 20 examples of where these practices have been reversed in my last slide, and they're local, right? So you can go to any number of the local sustainable farms in our area where people are raising animals in a sustainable way that doesn't have enormous impacts on the environment. That's the really simple answer, right? It's been reversed. It was reversed 30 years ago. You know, the farms we all imagine are the reversal of these things. Most of us can't even imagine what a CAFO is because we've never seen it and we've never been inside it. But as far as, you know, large scale reversal, you know, there's a farm in North Carolina that's in the news a lot. It's called Butler Farms. It's a CAFO. It's a concentrated animal feeding operation with a lot of swine on it. And the operator is contracted by one of these integrators. He just happens to be somebody who's content to kind of buck the system. And I think he's despised by the industry, but also somewhat feared because he's an open book. He's completely transparent. And he's perfectly willing to talk about the problems with the industry, the weaknesses with the industry, the attempts he's made to change things, but you know, there are farmers out there that want to do a better job. I think that's certainly true. And as Larry mentioned, there are farms that are operating, you know, radically differently. Centripetal, was that the name of the farm you were thinking of, Larry? Centripetal Farms?
I've heard of that one. I try to remember. I think it's Polyface.
Oh, Polyface. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you know Polyface. Yeah.
I've read about some of these, but it's just really difficult because of the system we have where, you know, if I wanted to go out and I wanted to say, look, I want to have a operation where I'm raising hogs, you know, I can't take those hogs to Smithfield to slaughter. Smithfield doesn't want my hogs. They don't want people to bring a hog that doesn't weigh exactly 220 pounds. They want every hog to be exactly alike, the same breed, the same size, everything, because they're going to put them on that line. And they got to put 35,000 of them a day through that line. And so they just created this system where it's just a assembly plant, or a disassembly plant, really. You know, it's very difficult to break in there without some real effort to make it possible to diversify the whole food system. But it's just like an ecosystem. If you have an ecosystem that is, you know, dominated by one species, and something happens to that species, that whole ecosystem is going to fail. If you have an ecosystem where you've got a lot of diversity, biodiversity, then you know, you can absorb a lot of problems before that whole system breaks down. So if we were operating a system where we had lots of farms and they were growing different types of animals and they were out on pasture and they weren't pumped full of antibiotics and they were we had, small scale slaughterhouse operations going on, we wouldn't have these situations where you've got enormous outbreaks of coronavirus and where you've got the inability for small farmers to break into a market with different types of animals, where you've got neighbors of these giant facilities that are literally dying early because they live next to them. It's I don't know if that answers your question, but there's not a lot of examples of breaking out from the CAFO system that I can think of in North Carolina.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? I do want to point out, and please jump in if I miss you, but we generally call out the folks that are running for office. As Kemp mentioned, voting is important. And it looks like we have Marsha Morgan in the video. And Marsha Morgan is running for office. Thank you for coming. Obviously, we're a nonprofit. We don't support or oppose elected officials, but we like to recognize those that show up to environmental events, as it might be an indicator that they care about the environment. So with that, are there any other questions or comments anybody wants to share? Don't forget to unmute yourself. All right, well, I'm going to unmute everybody then so we can have a nice goodbye. There we go. Everybody's vocal.
Bye-bye. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Wonderful presentation.
Thank y'all for coming.
Thank you so much, Kemp.
Thanks, Kim.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kemp.
Thanks, everybody. This is recorded, and I will post it up on the Facebook and the website. And the
Thanks, Kemp.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dana.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Dana.
Thanks, Kemp.
You're welcome.
Kim.
Kemp, I'm going to send you a list of some of the farmers that made changes. This is Debbie Davis.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Debbie.
But they're not just from North Carolina. They're people from different parts of the country who
Okay.
were CAFO. Some were cattle ranchers that had feedlots, which are very much like CAFOs.
Okay.
But there is a list of the farmers because they're also trying to help people like our CAFO owners get out, because the CAFO owners are trapped with $1 million debts. That's why they can't get out. And a lot of these people have, and there's been a huge group that's gotten together to help these people. I'm going to get that to you. And
That's great. We
I
could put
usually
it on the
don't get-
Facebook link, maybe.
well, I want you to review it and research it, because not all of them stayed with animal farming. Like the biggest Arizona chicken farmer who had multiple CAFOs, who desperately tried to do something like make organic chicken farming, which never worked. They ended up going into mushroom farming, which was much more profitable for them. So things like that, there's a lot of that all over the country. I don't know of too many CAFO feedlot owners who actually stayed with animal farming. They ended up going to pea farming or a different kind of farming, just completely got out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But they're still willing to help these people that want out, that are in the serious $1 million debt issue. And some of these are 5th and 6th generation farmers. So I'll try and get that to you. I'll email it to you hopefully in the next couple of days.
Okay, great. Thank you, Debbie.
All right. See you guys. Thank you for a great meeting.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Anybody else? I'm not gonna leave until everybody else leaves. So I could stay here all day. And usually after these things, people go up and talk to the speaker. So
I'm here.
this is the opportunity. He's here.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, sir.
The contract that Smithfield and these others, Tyson, that make with farmers, they provide all the inputs and feed and technology. And under the contract, they take back the product, which is the animal when it's full grown. Well, the big flaw is that they should be able to take back not only the animal, but they should take back the waste. That should
Exactly.
be part of the contract.
Exactly.
They should be responsible for the waste.
Right, and that's that integrator liability piece, which is, you know, if the integrator was liable for the impacts of their industry, you would see an immediate shift in the way these facilities were operated, right? If Smithfield Foods knew that it was on the hook anytime one of those operators violated a law, you can bet that things would change on those facilities. But they, you know, the genius of Smithfield's system is that, you know, the things that have liability, which is the land, the barns, and the waste, that's all owned by the farmer. The farmer has to take out a huge loan to build that barn. The farmer has, I think that might be Esther. Esther, you're breaking up real bad.
Got it.
So the farmer has the liability of the waste, the barn, and the land. And Smithfield, you know, like you said, they drop off baby pigs and they pick them up when they're grown. And that's a system where they have no incentive to do the right thing because they're not on the hook for doing the wrong thing.
Now, another thing I could comment about is about 10 years ago, the University of North Carolina actually was partly funded by the Agriculture Economics Division to partly funded by Smithfield also, they contributed to it, to come up with ways to resolve the whole waste issue. And these are all, I believe, documents that you can find. They came up with about a half a dozen viable alternatives. And they just turned it over, the University of North Carolina. Excuse me, North Carolina State, not University, North Carolina State. They turned it over, the report. Any one of those half a dozen was a viable solution. And of course, all of these solutions cannot contribute or cannot compete with the lagoon system, which is the cheapest system. And so Smithfield, from the get-go, said that they would not support any solution that would cost more than the present solution of the lagoon system.
Right.
And therefore, even today, I guess lagoons are outlawed for building new farms, but they're grandfathered in. So you still have all those old lagoons going.
That's exactly right.
So we come back to what your bottom line was there at the end. It is a big political issue. And that's the only way to solve it, is to elect the proper politicians, which is really tough.
Yeah. Yeah, and just a small clarification on something you mentioned, that agreement to research environmentally superior technology, that came out of a lawsuit that was filed against Smithfield in the 90s, and Smithfield didn't volunteer to fund that research. They were required by the attorney generals when they lost that lawsuit to fund that research, and they did it begrudgingly, and they have tried to block. They were also required to set up a fund that it was called the Environmental Enhancement Grant Fund that would fund projects to improve the environment, and they also just recently tried to block the use of those funds going for the types of projects that they were intended to go for, and only recently were defeated in court, so those EEG projects could move forward. So the industry has been tangentially involved, but only because they were forced to be involved in the funding of those alternative technology projects.
So I keep unmuting and muting y'all, so just keep an eye on that to keep the background noise down. Anybody else have any questions, comments?
I could hear somebody trying to break in earlier, but the audio was really bad and really delayed. But if that person is still trying to get in.
No. All right, well, I'm going to unmute y'all again then one more time. Okay, everybody's hopefully unmuted. Well, depends on your settings because some of you have me blocked from unmuting you. Just trying to be extra quiet, so that's nice of you. Well, thank you all. It's been a pleasure to see some of you and hear some of you, and we appreciate you coming again. This whole recording was, or this whole presentation was recorded, and I'll put it up on Facebook. I'll put it on our YouTube channel. I'll put it on our website. Our website does have, as of this week, all the First Saturday seminars. You can access them all on our website. You can click by the month and pull up either the PDF for those that have not been recorded, or this one and Maddie's last one in April that were recorded visually and audio. We've got the link to those too, so you can check them all out. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, y'all.